Ecuador says it wasn't aware of the U.S. extradition request. Do you buy that?
No. I mean, obviously they're lying. We were all very aware of the U.S. extradition request, and Chelsea Manning is currently in jail in the United States for refusing to testify before a grand jury on the subject. So plainly, this is a rather pathetic lie by the Ecuadorians.
And so why exactly make that lie? What were they trying to achieve with that?
Well, I think, obviously what President Moreno has done is a shameful and treacherous thing to do. And it will, of course, be particularly unpopular with the Ecuadorian people to hand over Julian Assange to the United States when the United States has done so much to impoverish and humiliate Latin American countries over decades. So he's trying to make out he didn't know he was handing him over for extradition to the United States. It's a blatant lie and a very transparent one.
Hillary Clinton has joked about Assange's arrest, saying he might be the only foreigner that the Trump administration would welcome to the U.S. What's your reaction to that joke?
Well, Hillary Clinton, of course, is very fond of making jokes about people being killed or people's misfortune in general. She's not a person with any empathy or compassion or any interest at all in human rights or anything except her own interest. So it doesn't surprise me coming from Hillary Clinton, but she's a very contemptible person and I don't waste too much time thinking about her.
For the last 2 days, we've seen that Western media has been talking a lot about Assange's behavior at the embassy, from late-night skateboarding to fights with security workers. Is there a feeling at all that they're trying to justify Ecuador revoking his asylum?
Yes, I mean, this plainly has been coordinated between the British, the Ecuadorians and the Americans, and the Ecuadorian side of it has been to put out this entire series of quite ludicrous lies about Julian Assange's behaviour in the embassy, none of which are true at all. So it doesn't surprise me. It's very sad to see a government like the Ecuadorian government behaving in this way, but it's part of a concerted campaign to distract the public from what this is really about, and this is really about extraditing something for publishing evidence of American war crimes, and they want us to be talking about anything except talking about the American war crimes which Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning revealed.
Exactly. Assange is now facing extradition to the U.S. and a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. So far, nothing related to the Trump-Russia investigation, but do you think that's likely to change if he finally does step foot on American soil?
I certainly don't think there'll be anything relating to the Trump-Russia investigation, because there was no connection between Russia and WikiLeaks, and no connection between WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign. So that, I certainly don't expect extra charges along those lines, because there's nothing to be charged for. What I do think, however, is that probably relating back again to the Chelsea Manning revelations, there'll be a much tougher charge of espionage coming along, carrying a potential life sentence or even potentially a death penalty. And what's happening here is something very dishonest and arguably illegal, in that the United States is going for a comparatively soft charge of conspiracy, carrying only a 5-year sentence, with the hope that that will get through the extradition procedures and be accepted as reasonable by a British court. But actually, once they get their hands on him, they've every intention of charging him with something much more severe, such as espionage. And I think we saw Sajid Javid in the House of Commons tip the wink by saying he could neither confirm nor deny that was the case in order to a planted question from a Tory MP. So plainly, a dishonest game is being played with the courts here about the charges that Julian would eventually face were he to be extradited to the United States.
And Assange's lawyer has already said that she's going to fight the extradition request. How likely do you think it is that they'll win that fight?
It's going to be an extremely important fight because when you think about it, what the Americans are claiming here is that a journalist cannot publish a leaked government document. That would be a tremendous blow to media freedom. And on top of that, remember, Julian Assange was at no time in the United States during this process. So what they're saying is that any journalist anywhere in the entire world who publishes a leaked American government document can be extradited to the United States and tried there even if they've never been there. So this is a very, very important fight. It's a fight on principles which I think the British courts will be forced to take into account, and it's a fight we absolutely must win.
To the world-famous Doughty Street Chambers in London to speak to Julian Assange's lawyer, Geoffrey Robinson QC. Geoffrey, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said Assange is no hero. No one is above the law. He said he's hidden from the truth for years and years. He will now face British justice. The Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, ahead of the release of a further arrest of Julian Assange, said he's rightly facing justice in the UK.
Well, he's not facing justice in the UK, other than for breach of bail, which is a very minor offence, usually dealt with by a fine or a few weeks in prison. These politicians so hate him that maybe they'll stir up the judges to give him a couple of months. But the justice that he's facing is justice or injustice in America, which wants him and has charges ready for up to 45 years imprisonment. And that's a long time.
So not the death penalty, which would prevent an extradition
look,
request.
the death penalty is a red herring, which the Ecuadorian government has used to justify its outrageous behaviour. It's cruel and really astounding breach of faith in handing over forcibly its own asylum seeker, whom they've given asylum to for 7 years, to the police. That's something that is unprecedented in the law of asylum and will make Ecuador a detested country among those who believe that asylum law should be properly conducted. But the claim that, the British government has told us they will not extradite, assured us that they will not extradite to a country with the death penalty, is simply nonsense. The British government faces a law that doesn't allow it to extradite anyone.
What if US authorities said that they weren't going to kill him?
The death penalty. Well, it's not one of the charges. He's charged with conspiracy with Chelsea Manning. Now, that means that he's charged with agreeing with Chelsea Manning to make public details of sometimes crimes against humanity committed by American troops. Remember the aerial manslaughter when they shot those Reuters journalists and a couple of children from the helicopter. That was footage that Assange made available and is now going to be, if the Americans have their way, is going to be a result in him not only spending years fighting the case, but being sent to jail.
And so Britain acts just like a colony. Obviously, under British law, you can't be arrested for a public interest release.
No, I mean, there
like
is...
it's not up to British authorities to work out whether that was
I would
okay.
hope that British judges have enough belief in freedom of information to actually throw out this extradition request.
But what does this mean for The Guardian, The New York Times, and Der Spiegel, Alan Rusbridger, The Guardian, the Schultzberg family?
They've all
could they all be
published
arrested
this material.
in connection with
this?
this?
They could be, but of course politically they won't be. The idea of making Assange a scapegoat is that he's not a particularly likeable person. He doesn't have the sort of establishment credentials of The New York Times or The Guardian. His conviction and sentence, just like Chelsea Manning's, will be a deterrent to other publishers in Europe, everywhere, to criticize and reveal information of misbehavior by American troops.
What if Ewan McCaskill of The Guardian reveals that Chelsea Manning was in close contact with The Guardian and so on? Is it up to those newspapers, in a sense, to defend Assange's honour? Because obviously Julian Assange has never stated that Chelsea Manning was the whistleblower. They have a dead letter drop kind of system at WikiLeaks.
Of course. No, he's been accepted the journalistic principle of protecting his source. That's something that journalists pretend and to follow, and sometimes their proprietors don't, because this is a monumental attack by this rotten American administration.
What about the politicization of justice in this country? Then you alluded to ministers. I mean, you have long been talking about the UN Human Rights Committee's adjudication that he was under arbitrary detention by the British government.
Yes.
Alan Duncan, the Minister of State for Europe and the Americas, says that's total rubbish.
Well, Alan Duncan doesn't know a thing about the law, and his comments, of course, are angled or hostile to Assange, as are all this government's ministers. And so can you expect him to get a fair trial when they're bad-mouthing him? I think you can, and I think British judges, I have faith in them, but whether I have faith in the US Supreme Court is another matter, because by the time this case comes before them, and we're talking maybe 5 years, how many Trump appointees will be on that court?
If indeed he's extradited,
And-
would you say he can't?
Well, I hope he won't be, but if he is extradited and faces an imprisoned long term of imprisonment, it will, of course, he will claim, because the Trump argument is this, that the First Amendment, which protects journalists famously, only applies to American journalists and doesn't apply to any foreign journalists, even those working for American papers. In fact, Jim Goodale, who was the hero of the Pentagon Papers case, he was the lawyer for the New York Times, he came out of retirement the other day and he said the Assange case, however much you dislike Assange, his case is the most important for media freedom since the Pentagon Papers case.
The ACLU backs that kind of thing. You founded this chambers, Doughty Street Chambers, and have always talked about free speech for years. I noticed that one of your colleagues, Amal Clooney, who I think works here, has been appointed by the Foreign Office as Special Envoy on Media Freedom.
Yes.
Can you help swing it? Can you and Doughty Street Chambers do it?
That's a matter that will be left to the Foreign Office. But as chambers, we do a lot of free speech work.
Geoffrey Robinson, thank you.
It's a very serious assault on the First Amendment, clear attempt to rescind the freedom of the press, essentially. This is the first indictment of a journalist, an editor or publisher, Julian Assange, and if it's successful, it will not be the last. This clearly is a part of President Trump's war on the press, what he calls the enemy of the state. And if he succeeds in putting Julian Assange in prison, where I think he'll be for life if he goes there at all, probably the first charge against him is only a few years, but that's probably just the first of many. So I think this is a warning, a shot across the bow of every editor and publisher in the country. I see on the indictment, which I've just read, that one of the charges is that he encouraged Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, to give him documents, more documents, after she had already given him hundreds of thousands of files. Well, if that's a crime, then journalism is a crime, because just on countless occasions, I have been asked by journalists for documents or for more documents than I had yet given them. So none of them have been put on trial up till now. But in this case, if that's all it takes, then no journalist is safe. The freedom of the press is not safe. It's over. And I think our republic is in its last days, because unauthorized disclosures of this kind are the life's blood of a republic. They're enabled to bring the kind of pressure on Ecuador that caused essentially a lawless action here, which threatens everyone in asylum, everyone in the world, in the people in this country who have been granted political asylum, people in Britain, and certainly in Ecuador. So that's very ominous. The British have had a long history here of servility, basically, with respect to their ally, the United States, and again are not too concerned, I think, about law.
To me, this is simply a continuation of the takeover of the world by the shadow governments of the world and their relationships internationally. That is the secret governments, but the behind-the-scenes bureaucrats and all that exist and are always there. They don't get voted in and out, and so I view that as I view them as the Praetorian Guard, determining who's president, who's the leader, and what the leader does, because they control all the information that gets fed to the president, for example, to make decisions. So they can tailor what they want him to do by focusing certain information to him and keeping others away, like shadow blocking. You don't allow other opinions to get to him so that he doesn't have the opportunity to see another view. So I view this as simply a continuation of that. This is how they have most of the mainstream media under wraps and doing what they want them to do now. But this is kind of like the nail in the coffin that says, if you ever do something that exposes all the crimes we're committing or any of the criminality that we're doing behind the scenes, if you ever do that, we'll get to you. And this is basically a very bad precedent that says no one in the world can do this without being charged with something. They'll manufacture some charge and say, we need this person extradited to our country, and then they'll take care of you internally in the U.S. with multiple other charges and throw things at you and do everything in secret because they'll call it national security, and you secret so you can't see it. No one in the court can see it except the judge, and they'll go behind closed doors, and the judge and the prosecution will decide the outcome of the trial. So it's all fabrication. They're not going to give him due process when he gets here, but the message is that everybody else in the world, either you conform to what we tell you to do, or we'll do this to you.
Should be no doubt in anybody's mind the contribution to journalism that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have had in the last decade, and I've been a part of that, which is multifold, and it would take me a bit of a time to just go through all of that. You talk about politics. There is no doubt in my mind, in anybody's mind, to take a second look at the entire thing. This is a politically motivated persecution against a journalist. And that is the essence of how we will fight it. That is the essence of the case, and it has been such throughout the years. He will never be able to face a fair trial in the United States. He should not be extradited on the basis that he was simply doing journalism, journalistic activity, and giving the political atmosphere in the United States. All the declarations that have been given there makes it absolutely obvious that he cannot have a fair trial there. He knew this was going to happen at any point. When you're referring to averting crisis, that was Friday last week when we learned through reliable high-level sources that the expulsion would be imminent. It was averted temporarily because we learned about it and we published it. Then on Wednesday we published the information about the extensive spying on Julian inside the embassy, which found the material found its hand to some Spanish individual who tried to extort money out of WikiLeaks on the basis of that. That seemed to have contributed to what happened yesterday when he was finally expelled in that disgraceful manner, where a foreign country invites the Metropolitan Police inside the embassy on Ecuadorian soil to arrest an Ecuadorian citizen and bring him out in chains in a disgraceful manner on a display with the intention to get a bad image out of it. But this has been an ongoing thing. In essence, basically, the only thing that changed was the fact that there was a regime change in Ecuador, and a president came into power who totally flipped on the previous administration position of independence and started to rub up to the United States. The New York Times posted a story in early December about the fact that Lenin Moreno had been discussing with a representative of the Trump administration the possibility of handing Julian Assange over in exchange for debt relief or favors in the International Monetary Fund. Absolutely disgraceful to turn on the person that you have promised shelter in that manner and basically sell him off. The lawyers that have been working on that angle, mostly out of Spain, from Baltasar Garzón's office, maintain that this is a violation of Ecuador's commitment, and they have brought the cases again before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and they will file new cases, as I believe. So it will be challenged, that disgraceful behavior. But we move on from that as well, because that is history now. We now have in front of us the real enemy, which is the extradition to the United States, which we've been saying all along is the ultimate thing that we need to fight, and not just for Julian Assange, not just for WikiLeaks, but for press freedom.
After nearly 7 years of arbitrary detention, captured the founder of WikiLeaks. Coming up on the show.
When one publication publishes a dynamite story, other publications don't have a story, and so they try and undermine the story in some way. They have to write something, so they'll often do that. And then, unfortunately, a lot of those people are too close to the very powers that they should be trying to hold to account. If we go back and look at what the US military, Robert Gates and General McMullen, said about our publications of creating hypotheticals that maybe they would cause harm. Our publications documented their involvement at a case-by-case level in the deaths of more than 20,000 people in Afghanistan and more than 108,000 people in Iraq. Those are the stakes that we were talking about. Not only the dissolution of two societies, but the deaths of over 100,000 people. And so when you want to distract from this, you just make the same accusation to the person that is making accusation against you. It's a kindergarten rhetoric.
The founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, there speaking to Going Underground from the Ecuadorian embassy. Before we go to Doughty Street Chambers in London to speak to Julian's lawyer, Geoffrey Robinson QC, about the legal and human rights implications of the case, I'm joined now from Sydney in Australia by legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger. John, welcome to Going Underground. You've said the arrest of Julian Assange by British authorities is a warning to all journalists. Explain.
It's a warning from history. It's a stark warning. Anybody watching that shocking image of Julian being forced out of the embassy by half a dozen police and pushed into a van will know that if that can happen to somebody for using journalism to let us know the truth, that can happen to anybody. And if Julian as he's in prison now, but if he's on the way to an American prison, well, the principle is unaltered. On the way to an American prison could be a host of other editors if they push their luck. Catherine Viner of The Guardian, the editor of the New York Times, and I don't say that lightly, the lead lawyer of the New York Times has said that if Julian and WikiLeaks can be prosecuted, so can the editors of those newspapers that carried their work. This is an assault on journalism. But you know, more than that, it's an assault on citizenship, because it can happen to anybody right across the world. It is saying that international law doesn't apply. Julian was an accredited beneficiary of the whole notion of asylum. The United Nations Working Party on arbitrary detention made that absolutely clear, and it was clear in covenants to which Britain is a signatory. Now, if that can be torn up, if a regime as mired in murk and corruption as the Lenin-Moreno regime in Ecuador is today, can call in the police in any country to arrest asylum seekers, then think of all the historical examples. We don't have to think about them so much. I reported from the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, and I watched the KGB and their associates do something similar to dissidents, intimidate them, march them out of their flats, intimidate their families. That was for political reasons. What has happened to Julian has happened on a political whim. The The idea that it's about bail infringement is ridiculous. We both know that. It's about getting him across to a supermax in the United States. It opens up a whole chapter of really diminishing the very principles that came out of the Second World War upon which the Universal Declaration is based. It shows how fragile they are. Do these lesser political beings in London, in this government, really understand that? Do they understand what they're setting in train? I don't think so.
You say it's a warning to journalists, journalists all around the world, let alone here in Britain, Sky News, Channel 4 News. Of course, the CNN in the United States seem much more keen to emphasize that this is nothing about these big values you're talking about. It's more about messiness in the embassy, now, of course, under the control of Lenin Moreno in Quito, and rape accusations.
Of course they do, because journalism in recent years has changed, not radically. It was always, the so-called mainstream was always an extension of the state, of the state's ideology. Our freedom of debate has diminished, that how the powerful are no longer challenged. They're challenged on a trivial level, but how they're not challenged about the greatest humanitarian disaster in the world today, and that is in Yemen, for which the British government is largely responsible, and where Britons are helping to direct this atrocity, helping with bomb aiming for Saudi aircraft and logistics and strategies and so on. When has this been made a burning issue of debate? We've entered a whole world of the abandonment of basic democracy, which is based on dissent, on challenging, on holding power to account, on revelation, on the embarrassment of power. Not trivial embarrassment, the embarrassment of the odd celebrity, but real embarrassment. And WikiLeaks provided that service, that public service of journalism. And it did it without fear or favor. You know, they published something like 800,000 documents on Russia. Documents from the Kremlin, documents that were used in court cases in Russia. They've published the same about China. But the United States and Britain, particularly the United States, has aroused the ire, because what we're in the midst of at the moment is the world's great superpower struggling to maintain its dominance, its information dominance, its technological dominance, its cultural dominance. And WikiLeaks has presented an extraordinary hurdle to this. Julian Assange then has become enemy number one, but he should be, and I don't say this lightly, he should be hero number one. Hero number one, because if we lose the Assanges, and there aren't many of them, if a handful maybe, there's certainly no one like him. If we lose the WikiLeaks, then we lose a whole strata of freedom. We stop questioning.
You said he is a hero. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, here said he is no hero. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, started in the House of Commons by saying the House should welcome his arrest. Alan Duncan, the Foreign Minister, said it's total rubbish to raise the UN ruling on arbitrary detention. And the judge, because quite apart from the media that we talk about quite often, the judge, District Court Judge here, Michael Snow in Westminster Magistrates Court, characterized Assange as having the behavior of a narcissist who can't get beyond his own selfish interest.
Well, that's just abuse. That's not a judge. That's an abuser. Another judge would recognize that as an abuser. The rest, frankly, you name Jeremy Hunt, the man responsible for for so much destruction of the National Health Service when he was Secretary of State for Health. I mean, frankly, I don't think these are credible people. I think in the world of politics, we're in a very diminished state. I'm trying to be polite about this, but I mean, commenting on what Hunt says or the rest of them, it used to be like commenting on what Boris Johnson says. There's the problem. There's another problem, of course. Where is the opposition? Diane Abbott made a spirited effort to describe Julian Assange's dilemmas and his health and so on. But what did the leader, what did Jeremy Corbyn say? He said that the government should oppose his extradition. I mean, frankly, it's best that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't say anything rather than tepid remarks like that. If there was an opposition leader who could stand up to the Mays, the Hunts, and the rest, then perhaps we'd have some sense of real truth in debate. To simply say the government should oppose the extradition is not enough. It should be spelt out in Parliament what this extradition might mean. That it threatens Julian's life, that he could end up spending the rest of his life in the kind of conditions that the UN reporter on torture has already described. He's already said that that's what he faces. That's what we need to hear from the political opposition in Britain.
Okay, well, let's go to one of the most important WikiLeaks revelations, according to Julian Assange. You've obviously covered so many decades of war by great powers. He said the US Special Forces Unconventional Warfare Manual about sabotage, subversion, intelligence, overthrowing foreign governments, specifically naming the IMF and the World Bank and OECD as players in these strategies for unconventional warfare. He said that was one of the most important leaks. Was it to you?
Yes, I think it was one of the most important leaks because it demonstrates the very nature of how the United States fights its colonial wars. There are so many leaks that are related to telling us about the true nature of war. Of course, what really got Julian into trouble, and Chelsea Manning, of course, was the video of collateral murder. And that expressed most graphically what I would describe as the whole homicidal nature of American colonial wars, and especially in Iraq, the 360-degree view of just kill them all. And anybody watching that video really has to read very little else of the WikiLeaks revelations about the nature of American wars, because there it is. There is a kind of consensual belief, I'm trying to think of a polite term for brainwashing, frankly, that we don't do these kind of things. We are perpetually benign on our side, and the Americans are part of that. These things simply do not happen. They only happen on their side. They're done by totalitarian states. They're done by rogue states, when in fact, clearly the biggest rogue state of all is the United States, the one that ignores international law, that has threatened the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has told her that she can't have a visa to visit the United Nations in New York.
Welcome back. I'm still here with legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger. As of the timing of this interview, there's been no real solidarity shown by Bernie Sanders, unlike fellow presidential candidate for the Democrats, Tulsi Gabbard. But here, we've been told, and in the United States, Clinton email releases by WikiLeaks were embarrassing, rather than any mention, say, of money for the Clinton Foundation from nations associated with Islamist terrorism. What's the difference here? Embarrassing versus corruption, and corruption against, arguably, the interests of the United States?
I think that shows the almost what is it? It's a kind of primal need to protect these people. The Clinton emails, the Podesta emails, what they showed was that Hillary Clinton, was a bedfellow of those who backed jihadism in the Middle East. That she knew that the backers of jihadism in the Middle East, principally Saudi Arabia, she knew what they were doing. So she knew about the source of jihadism when IS was at its height. And she was then Secretary of State. And she organized the biggest arms deal in history in selling arms, American arms, to Saudi Arabia. But it made her a de facto ally of jihadism in the Middle East. What that has to do with embarrassment, I don't know. If anyone's embarrassing, I would have thought she is, or ought to be, and her superiors and her underlings in Washington. It's a ridiculous way of characterizing it.
Let's go to Vault 7, the largest CIA leak in history via WikiLeaks. Important about the revelations of malware in all our mobile phones and making hacks appear as if they're from China and Russia.
Edward Snowden has explained all this. Your phone can spy on us. It really infuriated the CIA, and that's very understandable because it told us what they're up to. It told us the intensity and sophistication of their surveillance. And so much of this, and I mentioned earlier about almost everything has to do with America trying to reclaim its dominance, particularly in relation to China. The whole campaign against Huawei is over 5G technology. And Huawei has claimed, with some justification, that their devices are the only ones without a backdoor that the NSA cannot enter. In other words, you can have a device from Huawei that isn't contaminated by the NSA or the other agencies in the United States. And you can also have 5G. The Chinese development in technology is soaring ahead. That has so much to do with all of this.
What about the fact that Assange explicitly emphasized one cable from Ambassador William Roebuck to destabilize Syria, that big news story that's all but disappeared from all our front pages in recent weeks, that cable supposedly about instigating a war as far back as 2006?
The media, as I've said, is an extension of governments and their vested interests. And the British government, the US government, set out to overthrow the government in Syria. They've failed so far. They've failed. For those who wanted to know the truth, there it was in a WikiLeaks cable, the destabilization of Syria. But look, you can go back. I've seen MI6 cables back in the 50s that have been declassified that talk about the same thing, about how they can destabilize Syria. It was then Assad's father. Syria was an important piece in the whole Middle East chess game for Western powers, Western oil powers. It's been going on for a very long time.
John Pilger, thank you.